Thanks again, Brother Rob, and good afternoon, brethren and sisters. We've now come to the fifth promise that God makes to Abraham. We've just had read for us Genesis chapter 17, and there is a curiosity here. Here's a timeline of the life of Abraham to the birth of Isaac. So he leaves Haran at age 75, crosses over the Euphrates, becomes Abram the Hebrew. And then 10 years later, we have the events of Genesis chapter 15, where the fourth promise was made, and we of course considered that in our previous study. And then we have the birth of Ishmael when Abraham is 86 years of age. Now if you have a look at Genesis chapter 16, in the very last verse, verse 16, it tells us this: "And Abram was 86 old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram." He was 86 years of age. What does the next verse tell you about his age? Well, the next verse is Genesis 17 verse 1, and it says, "And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, he's 99. So how many years have passed between the end of chapter 16 and the beginning of chapter 17? Well, 13, because we read in chapter 17 that Ishmael was circumcised when he was 13 years of age. And we'll come to talk a bit more about Ishmael in due time. So there's a curiosity here, because when you come then to the record of Genesis chapter 21 and the birth of Isaac in chapter 21 and verse 6, that just takes 1 year. We have 5 chapters: Genesis 17, Genesis 18, Genesis 19, and Genesis 20. And the first 6 verses of Genesis 21 is just 1 year. And we read that in Genesis 17 and verse 21. Because it says, "But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year." It's exactly 1 year. This set time, exactly 12 months. And Isaac was going to be born from the delivery of this fifth promise in Genesis chapter 17. So why have we got silence for 13 years, do you think? Absolute silence about the life of Abraham. Then it takes 5 chapters to deal with 1 year. Well, we're going to see the reason for that. It's not there for no reason, as you can be assured. There is a reason for that. So look at this fifth promise then to Abraham in Genesis 17. He's 99. 9, of course, the number of finality and fullness. So here we got 99. He's come to a certain stage in life. He's been in the truth for 24 years. He's baptised in the Euphrates, so to speak. 24 years later, God says to him, "The time has come, Abram. It's come. I'm going to do 2 things in this fifth promise. I'm going to change your name, which will express my purpose in you. I'm going to hand you a knife, and you're going to cut your flesh off. You and all of your seed. You're going to cut your flesh off. That's a primary principle. You want to be a father and produce my family, then there's got to be a cutting off of flesh. It's a very important principle, isn't it? So when it says here that Yahweh appeared to him in verse 1, Yahweh appeared to Abram. This is the 5th appearance that God has made to Abraham. And guess what? He's going to make the 5th promise on this occasion. So we read in Isaiah 63 verse 9 that Michael the archangel is the angel of Yahweh's presence. And so I believe that Michael is used here. He's sent forth by God to appear to Abraham, because this is a very, very personal message. So God sends the archangel, the one who stands in his presence. And he calls himself, curiously here, for the first time in our Bible. See there in verse 1 it says, "And he said unto him, I am," it says in the King James, "Almighty God." There are 2 words there. El Shaddai. El, power, is rendered God. And this other word, Shaddai, it's the first of 48 occurrences of this divine title in the Old Testament. And it refers, as it always does primarily, it refers to God as the builder and the nourisher of a family. But it has another aspect to it. You're going to see in a minute as we look at the roots of this title Shaddai. But it has the other aspect of destruction. He can be a destroyer as well. And we're going to see this marvellously presented to us in Genesis chapter 18 through 20. Because you see, both of those aspects are going to be present in the events of this 1 year. In fact, to be very precise, in the events of 2.5 months. Yeah, 2.5 months. The chapters 17, 18, 19 and 20. It's all going to take place in 2.5 months, which we'll come to in a moment. The last occurrence of this title, Shaddai, in the Old Testament is in Joel chapter 1 verse 15. And if you read that, it's in the context of Yahweh being a destroyer. He's tried to nourish a family. That's what he wants to do. He wants to build a family. But if you don't want to cooperate with him, guess what he becomes? A destroyer. That's the principle of this title, El Shaddai. And so he says to Abram in verse 1, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be thou perfect. 2 Hebrew words. Halak panim. Now panim, of course, means faces. So the literal translation of this is, walk as though in my presence and be perfect. Well, none of us can be perfect. Anybody here perfect? Please. If there's anybody here perfect, please come and talk to me, because I want to know what your secret is. Okay? None of us are perfect, are we? But that it doesn't mean perfect in the parlance of the English language. That's not what God means. He's not going to ask Abraham to do the impossible, is he? It's impossible for people born of 2 human parents to be perfect. There's only one man who's ever been perfect, and he didn't have 2 human parents, and he had 1 human parent. His father was God, and that's what enabled him to be perfect. Okay, so it doesn't mean perfect in that literal sense. The Hebrew word is used right throughout the Old Testament. It's the word tamim. It means entire or complete. Can you be complete? Can you be single-minded? Can you have a single purpose in life? Can you devote your life just to the things that are important and leave the things that are not really important where they belong? Can you do that? Well, of course you can. And that's what God's calling on Abraham to do. And that's what he's calling on you and me to do. He doesn't expect perfection. What he expects is single-minded commitment, which is what John means in his epistles when he says perfect love casts out fear. What does he mean by that? We know the love there is agape. Agape's got to do with sacrificial love. It's committing yourself to something. Complete sacrificial love. Can you do that? Can you give God all your life? Can you make him everything in your life? Of course you can. It's all he wants from you, brothers and sisters. So he says to Abraham, you walk as though you're living in my presence. You know, the more conscious you are of God in your life, the more conscious you are of the angel that was appointed to look after your affairs. When you were baptised, the more conscious you become of that, guess what happens? Yeah, the more complete your life's going to be. The more you will keep away from corruption and sin. That's the simple principle of that. There's nothing hard about that, brothers and sisters. We can all do it. But you've got to cut your flesh off. So he says, I want you to walk as though in my presence and be complete. Now here's a knife. Deal with it. There's a knife. Okay, that's the principle. 24 years and he's ready for the job. So this title, El Shaddai, his first occurrence links with the Abrahamic covenant and Yahweh's delegated father. We're going to see that. He makes this covenant to Abraham, and to fulfill that covenant, he's going to delegate to Abraham his fatherhood. What we'd like to do is have a look at Romans 4 in a minute. I'm going to show you how important Romans 4 verse 17 is. Now here's the derivation of this title, Shaddai. It's derived from shad, the breast. So Yahweh is like a nursing father. Do you think that's a conundrum? Well, Moses didn't think it was a conundrum. In Numbers chapter 11 verse 11, he says to God, he's complaining about the weight of responsibility that was placed on his shoulder. He says, how can I be a nursing father to all this nation? He calls himself a nursing father. You go to Acts chapter 13, the same principle is used when Paul's in Antioch. He talks about God nursing Israel like a mother through the wilderness. Because you see, brothers and sisters, it's a simple fact that when God made Adam and Eve, what he did was to divide himself between those two. He gave to Adam a greater degree of the executive qualities of his character, so that the man was the decision maker, the leader. Not that the woman can't do that, but he got a greater degree. And he gave to the woman a greater degree of the sympathetic, the empathetic, the merciful qualities of his character. Not that a man can't show mercy, he can. It's just that the woman is more inclined that way. So the expectation was that husband and wife would join together to draw out of each other the things which they had less of the other. So the one who's got more would draw out the one from the less. You get the idea of that? So they could work together and produce the character of God. So when you are made immortal, guess what you're going to be? You're going to be a combination of male and female. Ready for that? Because you're going to be like your God. Your qualities will be male and female. He's the perfect manifestation of those things. That's why he can be called a nursing father. That's why he can use the title Shaddai, which comes from the breast. That's what mothers do, isn't it? Feed their children. Yeah. So Yahweh is presented in that way, and that's what he really wants to be, brothers and sisters. But if you don't work with him, guess what he's going to be? He's going to be a Shaddad. Shaddad means burly or powerful, hence to devastate or to destroy. We're going to see both of those things come out of Genesis 18 and 19. So the primary meaning is the strength of the nourishes. His purpose is to build a family. Both of these aspects are going to come out in this context. You know what he does? He destroys in order to build his family. It's a marvellous way. The balance of the divine character is unbelievable in this context. This is why there's so much recorded of just 1 year, and to be very precise, of just 2.5 months in the life of Abraham and Sarah. That's what's in front of us. So we'll do our best to get through that here this afternoon. So come to Romans chapter 4 with me. This is Paul's exposition of what happens in Genesis 17 and verse 1. Romans chapter 4. Now Romans 4, of course, is the chapter that deals with imputed righteousness, doesn't it? It's all about that. Let's come down to verse 16 of Romans chapter 4. Therefore, he says, it is of faith, that it might be by grace. Grace? Yeah. We're in the chapter, Genesis 17, of the 5th promise. That it might be by grace. To the end, the promise might be sure to all the seed. That means you and me. We're included in that, aren't we? To all the seed. Not to that only which is of the law, but to that which is also of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. And then we've got this parenthesis in verse 17 where he quotes. He says, as it is written in verse 17, I have made thee a father of many nations. Well, where's that from? Well, we know where that's from. That's quoted from Genesis chapter 17, isn't it? When he changes his name. He says, I'm changing your name for a reason. You're an exalted or lofty father. That's what your name Abram means. But I'm changing it to Abraham, which means the father of a multitude of nations. And of course we're incorporated in that. But then he says this, look at verse 17. After his parenthesis, when he quotes this passage from Genesis 17, he says, before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things which be not as though they were. Which of course is why he could give the land to Christ well before he's born. Okay? Because it's certain, sure. But what does this mean? Before him. Well, the Greek word, and you've had long enough to have a look at that on the screen, the Greek word katananti means down, over, against. Now let me illustrate this. You are down, over, against me. Right? I'm up here on a platform. You are down, over, against me. So here is Abraham standing in God's presence. Walk as though in my presence and be complete. Because what I'm doing, Abraham, is and it's an awesome thing, isn't it? I'm taking my fatherhood, because I'm building a family, and I'm delegating it to you. And you will be the father of a multitude of nations of Jew and Gentile. Awesome responsibility. Hence he says, here's a knife. Cut your flesh off. Now what does that teach you, brothers and sisters? You can take on responsibilities in the truth to build God's family. There's certain requirements, aren't there? There's certain requirements. There has to be a crucifixion of the flesh with its affections and lusts. You have to be at a certain stage of life. You don't give this to greenhorns and to babies in the truth. You give it to people who have been through a process that have led them to a point where you can have some degree of confidence that they've got the truth worked out in their lives. That's what this means to you and me. So, Abraham becomes the father of the faithful. Now, I'd like to just, if you can, I think I'm going to come back to Romans 4 in a minute, I'm pretty sure I am. Could you just pop something in Romans 4, a hand or whatever else, and come back to Isaiah 51. I want to show you how beautifully this is presented here by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 51 verses 2 and 3. You know, the chapter begins by an appeal, begins with an admonition to those who follow after righteousness. Look under the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged. So who are these? Well, we know who they are because we're told in verse 2. Look unto Abraham your father. Paul calls him the father of the faithful. And unto Sarah that bare you. Sarah? Yes. Well, she's called, brothers and sisters, in Scripture, the mother of us all. We'll have a look at the allegory in a minute and we'll see why that's the case. She represents the Abrahamic promises in the divine scheme. She's the mother of us all. She's Zion, who has children through the power of those promises. And we are those children. If we believe those promises, if we're baptised into Christ, we are the children of Sarah, the Abrahamic promises. The children of Zion. Yeah, wonderful allegory. Now, how do we know this is true? We just read the next verse. So let's read verse 3. He says at the end of verse 2, For I called him alone, and blessed him, and increased him. For Yahweh shall comfort Zion. That's all I want from that verse. Because what we have here is the explanation of what he means in verse 2. You have Abraham, the father of the faithful, all right? And Yahweh's the true father, isn't he? But he's delegated his fatherhood to Abraham. He becomes the father of the faithful. And you've got Sarah, who represents Zion. Yahweh shall comfort Zion. He'll bring forth a family. So you've got this wonderful equation, Abraham and Sarah, that we should look unto as our father and mother in the truth. But God has delegated to Abraham that fatherhood, as Paul says in Romans chapter 4. Now it's in Galatians chapter 4, of course, that we have the divine allegory. And I think you're pretty all familiar with this. Paul uses Genesis 16 and 17 as the basis of an allegory. So in Genesis 16, Ishmael is born from the bondslave Hagar, the Egyptian. It should never have happened, brothers and sisters. Abraham should never have been so stupid as to listen to the entreaties of Sarai, whose name, by the way, means dominating. He should never have listened to her words. Because she said, well, God didn't say anything about the mother of this child that you're going to have, did he? So she said, well, how about, I can't bear children, so how about you have Hagar? And he foolishly accepts that proposal. And of course, we know the wheels fall off. But God picks up the pieces. He picks up the pieces and he uses this as an allegory, a brilliant allegory. It should never have happened. And so what we've got here, we've got Hagar, that in Galatians chapter 4 is presented as the type of the Mosaic covenant. And she has a son, Ishmael, who's a bondslave, which is what Jews were, living under law, weren't they? So Ishmael becomes, and of course people should know that Ishmael's the father of the Arabs. God's not interested in that. He's interested in what this means for his people. And so Ishmael becomes the type of Jews, children of Abraham, living under the law. And Christ got up their nose in John chapter 8 because he says, if you know the truth will make you free. And they said, well, we were never in bondage to any man. He was talking about this allegory. We be the children of Abraham, they said. Yeah, but you're in bondage because you're living under law and you think you can be saved by law. You can't be saved by law. Right? This is the allegory. Ishmael was circumcised in the flesh, and so were all Israelites, but they were not circumcised in the heart. And that was the difference. On the other side of this equation, you've got Sarah. She represents the Abrahamic covenant. She brings forth a child of promise by faith. She represents spiritual Israel. Isaac represents spiritual Israel, the product of faith, circumcised in the heart. They're Jews, says Paul in Romans 2:20. They're Jews inwardly. The circumcision to them, which means to us baptism. Baptism has brought them into the Israel of God. They are the seed of Abraham. So Ishmael was the result of human failure. But is there anything too hard for our God? No. He can take human mess and make something brilliant of it, brothers and sisters. That's what he can do. And he can do that in your life, and he can do it in mine. I want you to come back now to Genesis chapter 17. I'm not going to take you to Romans 4 just yet. Let's come back to Genesis chapter 17. And we come to verse 4. Where God says to Abraham, "As for me," now you might be aware that this is the as for chapter. This is quoted in Isaiah 59 verse 20, by the way. You want to just jot that one down. We won't talk about this until tomorrow, but for those of you who won't be here tomorrow, if you want to really see a connection, jot down Isaiah 59 verse 20. It begins with the words, "As for me." All right? Comes straight out of Genesis chapter 17. This is the as for chapter, which I'll demonstrate to you in a minute. So he says in verse 4, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations." He's going to delegate his fatherhood to Abraham. You know, this is going to culminate in something, isn't it? It's going to ultimately complete the divine family, which is why when you get down to verses 7 and 8, you read some very important words. So let's just read on. Verse 5, "Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham." So he's going to go from a lofty or exalted father to being the father of a multitude of nations. And he says, "For a father of many nations have I made thee, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful. I will make nations of thee, kings shall come out of thee, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant." And in actual fact, you know that word there, everlasting, is olam. It's the covenant of the olam, which means the covenant of the millennial age, all right? Because the whole point of the Abrahamic covenant is to bring all the nations back into one, and it's going to happen during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That's the hidden period. So it's the covenant that relates to the things that have got to do with the millennium. He goes on to say this at the end of verse 7, "To be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." You know, brothers and sisters, when he says, "I will be their God and they shall be my people," that's the essence of what we've just read. You're going to find that statement made 7 times in the prophets. You read that in Jeremiah? You read it in Ezekiel? Yeah, you'll find it in the prophets. That I will be their God and they shall be my people. It's a reference to the Abrahamic covenant. You'll find it in places like Jeremiah 33 about the new covenant, which some think is entirely new. That's rubbish. It's the Abrahamic covenant, because he says, "I will be their God and they shall be my people." You know where you last read it? You read it in Revelation 21 verse 3. When God dwells among men, when he's all and in all, he says, "I will be their God and they shall be my people." What's that? That's the culmination of the promise. "I will make of thee a great nation." When we're in the 8th millennium, that's when that's going to come to pass. But it's true now that if we're in the Abrahamic covenant and God is working to redeem us, well then we are his people and he is our God. It's a very, very important statement. But come to the next "as for." Now it doesn't say this in the King James Version, because when you come to verse 9 of Genesis 17 it says, "And God said unto Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant." But that's not a good translation of the Hebrew. Rotherham's is. Rotherham says, "But as for thee." So in verse 4 it's God, "As for me." In verse 9 it's Abraham, "And as for thee, my covenant must thou keep." And then of course he introduces the covenant of circumcision. But come to verse 14. It says, "And the uncircumcised man child," but in the Hebrew it should read this way. Rotherham's translation is, "But as for the uncircumcised male." So we've got number 3 in the list. We've got God, we've got Abraham and the uncircumcised males of his family. But then come to verse 15. And we read in verse 15, and God said unto Abraham, as for Sarai, thy wife. And then you come to verse 20, when he says, and as for Ishmael. So he picks them off, one by one. He starts with himself and says, I'm the guarantor of all this. I'm delegating to you my fatherhood. And as for you, this is what you'll do. And as for your uncircumcised males, this is what you're going to do to them. And as for Sarai, this is what's going to happen to her. And as for Ishmael, see, this is the as for chapter of the Bible, which is why it's so significant when you get to Isaiah 59 verse 20. And that's another story, but we'll come to that in due time, God willing. So he hands him a knife, and the covenant of circumcision is introduced to demonstrate the method of participation in the Abrahamic promise. You know, this covenant of circumcision preceded the law of Moses, brothers and sisters. It preceded the law of Moses. We're told that in John 7:22, and it's obvious, isn't it? It's the seal of imputed righteousness by faith. And have a look at some of these references here. Romans chapter 4. Romans 4, I did say I'm going to come back here, and here's the passage I want. Romans 4 verses 9 to 11. It's the seal of imputed righteousness by faith. And we read there in Romans 4 verses 9 to 11 these words. Then cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Well, not in circumcision, because he wasn't circumcised in Genesis 15, was he? That didn't come until Genesis 17. Okay, Paul goes on, not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. And he received, look at verse 11, he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had yet being uncircumcised. What for? That he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised. That righteousness might be imputed unto them also. So what does that mean for you and me? We've got to come along to Colossians chapter 2 to find this out. Come to Colossians chapter 2. So what is this circumcision he's talking about? Well, females are not circumcised, are they? When they're born, like many males are. How does it apply to them? Well, it definitely applies to them, and Paul tells us how. In Colossians chapter 2, we read in verses 11 to 13 these words. In whom, he says, he's talking about Christ, in whom also ye are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands. So you don't use a knife for this one. All right? It's made without hands. In putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. How do we do this, Paul? How do we do this? Well, the next verse tells us. Verse 12. Buried with him in baptism, wherein also ye are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised him from the dead, and you being dead in your sins, and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all your trespasses. What does that mean? He's imputed righteousness to you. Yeah. You got that? That's what that means. When we read that circumcision is the seal of the faith that Abraham had that led to him being imputed righteous. That's how it happens in our lives, brothers and sisters. We believe the promises made to Abraham, and we enter the waters of baptism. Our sins are washed away. God imputes righteousness to us. Exactly the same pattern. And it's also intended to be an outward sign of an inward change. Now, I mentioned that. For the sake of time, I'm not going to take you to Romans chapter 2. But Paul talks about those who are Jews inwardly. It's not about circumcision of the flesh, he says. It's about circumcision of the heart. And you become a Jew inwardly. It's an outward sign of an inward change. But while we're here in Romans 4, no, we're not in Romans 4, we're in Colossians. Come back to Romans 4. Come back to Romans chapter 4. I want to show you something curious. Now, if you've got your thinking caps, pull them on hard. Okay? quotes Genesis 15 verse 6 and Genesis 17 verse 5 in this chapter. Let's see if we can pick these out. Can someone help me out here? Where's he quoting? Genesis 15 verse 6, which is he imputed faith unto Abraham, he imputed righteousness unto him. Well, it's in this chapter. Can someone point that out to me? You didn't? Yep, okay. So in verse 8, you've got, that's a quotation from the Psalms, from Psalm 32. Anybody else? I'm doing this for a reason. This is the graveyard session, all right, where it's very hard to stay awake because you haven't got any blood in your brain. It's all in your stomach, all right, working on the food you've just eaten, that delightful Indian food that I didn't get to taste, okay? So this is a little exercise for you. Have we got it? It's actually quoted in verse 18, right at the end of the verse. So shall thy seed be, all right? Yeah. He imputed unto him righteousness because when he said that, Abraham believed him. So he also quotes Genesis 17 verse 5. We read it in verse 17, didn't we? So how many years apart was Genesis 15 verse 6 from Genesis 17 verse 5? 14. 14 years apart. Abraham, the name, occurs 7 times in Romans chapter 4 and only 9 in the whole of the book of Romans. The term father appears 7 times in Romans chapter 4 and 12 in the whole book of Romans. The term circumcision or circumcised appears in total, in aggregate, 7 times here in this context. But uncircumcised and uncircumcision, which refers to Gentiles, only occurs 5 times here. Is that accidental, do you think? 7's the Abrahamic covenant number. That's why you've got all of these facts coming forth. But is that what I'm here for? No, not really. Because you see, in verse 16 we read this. Wherefore, out of faith that according to grace it might be. This is why uncircumcision is only there for. It's a reference to the inclusion of Gentiles. When did that happen in the promises made to Abraham? In the 5th promise. When he changes his name and delegates his fatherhood, he says, I have made thee a father of a multitude of nations. That's when it happens, brothers and sisters. And it's a simple fact that if you take the 2 dominant numbers here, the important numbers, apart from 7, you've got the 14 years between these 2 events, these 2 promises, and you've got 5 the number of grace. When I went to school, if you multiplied 14 by 5 times 14 is 70. And 70 is the number of the nations. How precise is that? All right. When God sets out to set forth before you and me what he's doing in Abraham, there is a precision that is awe-inspiring. And so it should be. So Abram's name is changed. He receives the responsibility of a delegated father. We should come back now to Genesis chapter 17 and verse 5. You should keep that thinking cap pulled hard on, okay? Genesis 17 verse 5. What does God do here? He takes the name Abram, turns it into Abraham. What is he going to do? Well, he's going to add the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which comes out in an English form like H, okay, with a numerical value of 5, because the Hebrew and the Greek both have numerical values. So you've got Aleph, Beth, 1, 2. You get to the 5th letter, it's got a numerical value of 5. Got that? And he pops this 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet into the 5th position of Abraham's name. Now Abraham has a numerical value of 243. Abram has a numerical value of 243. But the name Abraham, because it's got an additional consonant, there's a vowel, but of course the vowels were in the margin, not in the actual text. Abraham has a numerical value of 248. And it's a fact that the name Abraham occurs 248 times in the Bible. All right, so there's precision in that. Abram has 5 letters, 4 consonants and 1 vowel. Abraham has 7 letters, 5 consonants and 2 vowels. So there's structure here, isn't there? But he does the same to Sarai, but it's different. You have a look at verse 15. It says this, "And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai, whose name means dominating, thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be." Now Sarah means a princess, right? Now, where does a princess stand in relation to a prince? What's the echelon? What's the order of authority? Is the princess more powerful than the prince? No. Princess is subject to a prince, true? Okay, it's very important. Because you see, we know from this chapter, brothers and sisters, that Abraham believed God. When it says that he laughed in verse 17, that he fell upon his face and laughed, Paul tells us in Romans that that was the laughter of belief. But Sarai did not believe. She did not believe that she could produce this promised child Isaac. And chapter 18 is all about that, as is chapter 20, as we're going to see. So the promised seed could not be conceived without faith in the humanly impossible. You see, I've got up there, Mary. Well, Mary did believe. And she said to Gabriel, "I'm ready." The promise was made she would bring forth the Son of God. And she said, "I'm ready. The handmaid of the Lord is here. I'm ready." Not Sarai. So the divine pattern demanded that Sarah acquire Abram's faith concerning the promised seed. She had to be brought up to the same level as Abraham. Now Paul talks about this in Galatians 4 verse 19. Because this whole process, and we're going to see in Genesis 18 in our final session here today, is about forming Christ in Sarah. She's going to bring forth Isaac. He's the type of Christ. He's the promised seed through whom the promises will be fulfilled. You can't do that without faith, can you? She's got to have the same faith as Abraham. And Paul writes to the Galatians in that context and he says, "My little children, of whom I travail in birth again, until Christ be formed in you." It's very, very opposite language, isn't it, to what we're considering. So the events of Genesis 18 to 21 are designed to accomplish this. And he's only got 2.5 months. Because it's a normal gestation period of 280 days. That's 9 months and 10 days. Normal gestation period. You take that off 12 months because he's very clear. Isaac will be born exactly 1 year from now. Take off 9 months and 10 days. What do you got? 2.5 months. To bring Sarah up to the same level of faith as Abraham. Quite a job, eh? And he's done it. He's going to do it. He's going to do it by being El Shaddai. He's going to build his family by destroying. He's going to blow Sodom and Gomorrah off the face of the earth for one reason. Not because they were wicked. Oh, they deserved it. He could have done it any time, couldn't he? But because he's going to work on Sarah. That's what it's about. The whole process of blowing Sodom and Gomorrah away is about bringing Sarah up to the same level of faith as Abraham. Sarah's submission is memorialised in her name being changed from dominating to a princess. So what does God do to her name? We know that 5 is the biblical number for grace. And in verse 15, Yahweh replaced the 5th letter of Sarai's name with a numerical value of 10. So what he does, instead of doing what he did with Abraham, he puts a consonant in. He takes a consonant out of Sarah's name and he puts another one in its place. He takes out the consonant which has a numerical value of 10 and he puts the same letter he put into Abraham's name into her name. It has a numerical value of 5. So what's the net result of this? Well, Sarai has a numerical value of 510. It's got 5 letters, 3 consonants, 2 vowels. Sarah has a numerical value of 505. It has 5 letters, 3 consonants and 2 vowels. Nothing is done in relation to the number of consonants or vowels. It leaves it the same. But the net result is that they're separated in the change of names by 10. Sarah is reduced by 5. Abraham is increased by 5. The difference now is 10. And 10 in the scripture stands for all. This is about Sarah's submission to Abraham. You see that flashing on the top there? Do you think that's sort of like a mistake? No. I want you to have a look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. What's the context of 1 Peter 3? Well, I'll tell you what it is, because the beginning of the chapter tells you. It is the submission of a wife, even to an unbelieving husband. That's what Peter's saying. He says in 1 Peter 3, he says, "Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may also, without a word," there's no article there, by the way, you don't win people without the Bible. I'm talking about the word. He says that they may be won without a word. Notice you don't nag them, okay? By the conversation or the way of life of the wife. So his context is submission even to an unbelieving. So who's he going to use as an example here, do you think? Abraham. Abraham, who pushed his wife into the palace of Pharaoh. And when they get down to Gerar, he does the same again. And she ends up in the harem of Abimelech, bereft of help from her husband. And Peter says in verse 7, he says, "Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge." Was Abraham acting on the basis of knowledge? No. He's a coward. "Dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honour unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel." What for? As being heirs together of the grace of life. So he puts the number 5, the number grace into Abraham's name and increases his value. And he takes out 10 from Sarai and puts 5 into her name and decreases her value. And the difference is 10, all. It's about Sarah's submission. And she's going to show that submission in the house of Abimelech. And she's going to come out of that house believing in the impossible, brothers and sisters. And when she's up to Abraham's level of faith, God says, right. It's first contact they have, bingo. Isaac's conceived. And 9 months and 10 days later he's born. And all happens in 2.5 months. Got a picture? The set time. So let's come back and finish the session off with the set time again. In Genesis chapter 17. Heirs together of the grace of life. So here in Genesis chapter 17 we read in verse 21. And by the way, look at this allegory in verse 20. Isn't this marvellous? Look at verse 20. We know what Ishmael represents in the scheme of things. He represents Jews living under law. So let's read verse 20 with that understanding. And God says, "As for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget." Yes, Israel would have 12 tribes. 12 princes shall he beget. "And I will make him a great nation." Israel is to become a great nation in part. See what God's doing here? Ishmael becomes the type of natural Israel living under law. The allegory of Galatians chapter 4. But look at verse 21. "But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year." So it's got to be exactly 1 year away. As we said, in verse 1, Abraham's 99. And in Genesis 21 verse 5, the record tells us he's 100 years of age when Isaac is born. There's exactly 1 year. The normal gestation period, as we said, is 9 months and 10 days. It leaves just over 2.5 months for the events of Genesis 17 to 20. Where Abraham's circumcised, it's a pretty painful exercise, visited by 3 angels, Sodom's destroyed, Lot's delivered, they move from Hebron to Gerar, Sarah's in Abimelech's house, And Abraham prays for Abimelech's house and God heals them. And Sarah sees it and says, wow, if he could do all that, I can believe that he can bring forth from my dead body Isaac. And that's exactly what happens. What a wonderful thing that is, eh? I will make thee a father of a multitude of nations. And when we come to Genesis 18 in our final study today, we're going to see that it's true, brothers and sisters. It's true. We have to believe this. God can complete in us the work that he has begun. What he wants from us is conviction. He wants the conviction that nothing is too hard for Yahweh, our God.